All right, today is Saturday, October 18th in 2025, and my guest is Mary Ruwart. Mary is a retired biomedical researcher and a libertarian speaker, writer, and activist. Mary is the author of the book Death by Regulation: How We Were Robbed of a Golden Age of Health and How We Can Reclaim It, among many other books. I read the book voraciously. It was very meticulously well argued and is really well written and speaks to the themes of this podcast. In fact, I kind of regret that I've read it so late because I've been talking about these topics for such a long time. Back then I read Alex Tabarrok, Sam Pelsman, and the whole Milton Friedman public choice crowd, of course. But your book is definitely the best among them. Like, there were so many things that, despite sort of talking on this podcast about for years, that I hadn't known, or at least not found a way to put them so succinctly. So really great book. And
Thank
besides the book, you also have had a very interesting career and insights from working in the biopharmaceutical industry yourself. So we're
Yes.
going to talk about that and about pharmaceutical regulation and all of that. So Mary, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you. Thanks for having me. And don't beat yourself up about not knowing everything because that's why I wrote the book. I realized that very few people knew what I knew. Maybe a handful of people could have written this book. So I figured I better get it out there before it's too late.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you're speaking from your own experience, and you also say in the book and talk about how you couldn't have written about it really when you were in this industry, right?
That's
So
correct.
maybe you, yeah, so maybe you can talk a bit about sort of your career up to the moment when you wrote the book, and how you were kind of experiencing these questions and how you were kind of grappling with it yourself. Because when you're
Yes.
in it, you kind of have even a different incentive structure, right? So I tend to kind of observe that people are almost like ignoring these questions because there's just no solution there for you, right? So how was your journey?
Yes, well, actually, when I started, of course, I knew very little about the pharmaceutical industry or how it gets a drug out to market. So my first I joined the Upjohn Company in 1976 after a bachelor's in biochem, PhD in biophysics, and postdoc in surgery. So I had a very diverse background. And I was unaware of the 1962 amendments to the Food and Drug Act, but I learned very quickly because they were coming into effect in the 70s. There had been a lot of lawsuits by the pharmaceutical industry against the government and the FDA up until that time. So it took a while for them to really get engaged in the industry. And my biggest concern when I went in the pharmaceutical industry is I'm going, how does any drug make it to the marketplace? Because the regulations were not as specified as people think. This was a time when the FDA was just getting them started and they kept changing their mind. We had one gentleman who came to our project team meeting and said we had to redo 2 years of toxicology studies in animals because he said the FDA is going to change the regulations and we'll have to start all over and we might as well do it now. So this was the type of problem that the industry had, and the industry could not sue the FDA. The Supreme Court ruled against that because they said, that the industry would and the FDA would be in court all the time. And that was partially because the FDA was being what was perceived by the industry as being very unfair. And up to that point in time, I think the industry as a whole was a pretty ethical industry. I was blessed in that I was in probably one of the last survivors of that. And what ended up happening was, we started out with scientists making the decision in the pharma companies. But as time progressed, the FDA regulations that resulted from the 1962 amendments got more and more rigorous because there was no stopping them. They could just do what they wanted and what the FDA wanted. And you kind of understand their perspective. Congress funded the FDA. So if Congress heard anything bad about side effects. They beat up on the FDA for approving a drug. And well, of course, all drugs have side effects. So it was only a matter of time. So the FDA countered that by trying to think of every study they could that they might need to defend themselves. And so the time from the bench to the marketplace went from 4 years to 14 years. And I was in the industry as this transition was happening. So I could easily see that this increased timeline was really killing the industry. And eventually, what ended up happening is in 1992, the industry co-opted the FDA with the Prescription Drug User Fee Act, which eventually ended up supplying about 70% of the salaries of the portion of the FDA that approves drugs. So now instead of Congress funding the FDA, pharma was funding the FDA, and that changed the whole way that pharma operated, because now it was much more lenient towards the pharma companies, the big pharma companies that liked dealing with the big pharma companies, did not like dealing with the young startups. So the biotech startups basically had to license their products, which really were most of the new drug products, to the big pharma companies, and took kind of a big financial hit when they did that. Yes, the pharma people gave them money, but compared to the profit they could have made pre-1962, it was very little. So that's the skinny on that. And basically, based on the fact that people died waiting for life-saving drugs, much innovation became impossible because of these laws. And that was because it was no longer feasible financially to have a short-term drug treatment. So those weren't being done. What was being done were lifetime drug treatments, drugs that you took for the rest of your life. And those were the only
As
ones.
opposed to like a treatment that could actually, fix you in one shot, right?
Yes. Well, of course, I think given the given how much scientific knowledge we don't have, even at this point in time, I'm not sure that would have not happened eventually. But, basically things like antibiotics, new antibiotics that would help us, overcome the drug resistance in both the hospitals and in, the general public. The antibiotic companies really stopped doing their thing. I mean, when I was at Upjohn, antibiotics was one of their big projects when I came in. It was almost nothing when I left. So that's really scary when you think about it. There are drugs that just never get to market because they're too risky, because they're so new. You don't know what's going to happen. Or, they don't get to market because they will not recoup the money that the drug company spends getting the FDA approval. And so what happened, instead of the scientists making the decision, the bean counters did. And they really mostly were clueless about true medicine. So they made a lot of dumb decisions. Like I remember we meaning the scientists at Upjohn, were trying to promote the idea of prostaglandins for ulcer disease because they were quite protective of the stomach. But the bean counters said, "Oh, there's no reason to do that. We have surgery for that." And of course, that when the other companies developed drugs for ulcer treatment, of course, they became the best-selling drugs in the world at that time.
There's so many things I want to double click on because this is such a vast and rich experience and so many points, but I still want to stay a bit longer with your personal experience in your career. And I'm especially curious kind of from the time when all these changes were happening, what was kind of the internal perception of these changes in pharma and kind of how did that change over time, right? So as you kind of indicated, and as I also heard others say, pharma didn't really want these changes,
No, they
right?
fought
Which is kind of counter to the regulatory capture theory by George Stigler, which kind of suggests that these companies go out there to get these regulations so they can
No,
shut out other competitors. But it's
yeah.
more like happened on them, and then they arranged themselves into it. In 1992 was kind of when they had captured it, because they were just arranging themselves with the status quo, right?
Well, yes. Well, I can tell you that in general, regulations are promoted by the very industries that they regulate. I think this is an exception. I mean, the pharma companies fought back while it was in Congress. They sued after the law passed. I don't think that's what they wanted. And the reason they didn't is they saw it would destroy the industry, and it pretty much did. You know, by the time 1992 came about, I think there were only 2 or 3 drugs that would make back the cost of getting the FDA approval. Well, what that meant is that the entire industry was dependent on blockbuster drugs. And of course, it was costing, like $2.5 billion pretty much at that point to get a new drug approval. So the companies were merging into a cartel. It was the only way they could survive a blow if the FDA said you can't market this drug after they spent all this money. So I think this is an exception to what I would consider a rule. And I think that it's hard to know that unless you were in the industry during that time. So I understand why people thought that. But if they actually look at the history of this, and the comments that the heads of pharmaceutical companies made when these regulations were trying to be passed, and the result, because the result was, of course, there were very fewer, probably about a third of the innovation was lost immediately, and over time it became closer to 50 to 70%. In my book, I say 50% because that was the conservative estimate. It just depends at what point, you say that the drugs are not going to market. But it was probably closer to 70. I try to be very conservative in my book, but I estimated that each of us, not just in the US, but overseas as well, because, we were the big pharma companies, have these regulations have cost us 5 to 10 years of our lives. This is huge. The 5 years because of the impact on drugs, but the additional 5 years because of the impact on prevention. So what happened was the FDA, and this is even before the 62 amendments, they just did not like supplements. And that was too bad because the pharma companies were actually the ones promoting supplements at that time because they were the only people who could. And the reason they could is they had the manufacturing process. And even today, many of the supplement companies are buying their raw materials from the pharma industry because they have the manufacturing expertise. Now, not all of them, but a lot of them.
Yeah. Now, let's roll this up a bit for listeners that aren't necessarily too familiar with what we're talking about here. So things like the drug lag and the Kefeuver-Harris amendments and all of that. So what's kind of your starting point? What would you say to someone who's saying, well, isn't the pharmaceutical industry doing great? Right. So these companies are very large. They're making a lot of profits. We have so many drugs available. There's so much innovation that's going on. The American drug companies are doing very well. It's very large consumer markets. So what would be kind of your starting point in telling people, hey, there is kind of a problem here or something to solve?
Well, after 1992, things kind of switched. So what happened was the FDA started approving things that shouldn't be approved, like Vioxx, and many people would say the COVID vaccine. And I would tend to agree with them on that. I didn't take it because I knew there's only 2 months of safety, profiles, and that's not enough. That's like very substandard for the industry. But actually, I've predicted that something that you actually reported on, Niklas. Seeing all this, I felt like, as long as the industry could not make up its, what it paid to get an FDA approval, its internal, what you call the internal rate of profit, would go down. And you had a slide in a recent talk of yours that showed that. I haven't looked at that data yet, but I did
Yeah.
read, I think I did read the paper that came from. It was interesting because the paper shows this graph and then it says that nothing's changed. I didn't really understand that. But also, it looks like the cost of getting an FDA approval has flattened out. I think that was your data as well, which is good because it's like $2.5 billion. I mean, it's incredible how much it costs to get a new drug to market. And that's why pharma will only work on things that are lifetime drugs, basically. They won't even start to do a different one. Like I was working with prostaglandins and liver disease when I was at Upjohn. The FDA actually called me up and said, "Oh, we're so excited about this because there's nothing for liver disease. We recommend bed rest, which is nothing, so we're going to help you get this out." And I was young and naive, so I thought that meant something. But the thing is, the FDA at that time, their regulation said you had to have 2 U.S. studies that showed statistical significance of that 0p, less than 0.05. I know some of your listeners probably don't understand what that means. What it translates into, there's only a 5% chance that you're not really seeing a cure. So, you do some mathematical stuff to show that. But it's actually it's a pretty difficult standard to meet. And the problem we have when we have something totally new is that we don't know how much drug to give. We don't know how often to give it. We don't know if we have to give it for years because liver disease is a slow disease that develops over years. And, it probably would take years to get rid of because it basically puts scar tissue in the liver. That's a good way for a lay person to think about it. Scars don't go away very easily. If they do, you have to really work at it. So also you had to be able to measure it. And that was tough to find a measurement in the blood, which we actually did develop in conjunction with some Germans in order to be able to do the studies because we didn't want to have to stick a needle in somebody's liver every few months to measure progress, right? That's not a safe procedure to be doing that often. So because of all this, the bean counters said, no, we're not going to even try to develop this because even though it might be life-saving, there's too many risks. What would happen is we'd have to do these long studies. And then if we didn't have each parameter correct, we wouldn't get statistical significance. And then we'd have to start over. And by then our patent would run out. And so then any other company could make our drug and sell it. And, we've spent all this money. So they would not do it. And that's what happened to innovation. It's a good example for your audience about why we're not getting the kind of innovation that we need.
Yeah, so I try to use that graph to show, okay, if this continues, we won't get any more biotech, or it will all go to China, right? Because it's so expensive. So I think just to give people a sense of, all right, there's something we need to change like now. This is not some abstract theoretical idea. And then there's really so many things to talk about. Like what you described, I would basically say is a lack of, or the way the regulations are set up, they prevent iteration. Right. So you can't just go and sort of change the profile slightly of the amount of dosage you give, the patient profile itself. Right. So what you talked about, like statistically significant for what or for whom, like what's the target population. Right. And, what if it's effective for like a subgroup of the target population?
Yes.
It doesn't reach a significant threshold based on your initial selection, but it might still be a very good drug for some people.
Exactly.
Right. So.
Exactly. So the way the statistics work, so that your audience understands here, is if you had a cancer drug that cured 10% of the people you gave it to, that would not be statistically significant. But if you had a blood pressure drug that just took the blood pressure down a couple millimeters and everybody got their blood pressure, or maybe 7 out of 10 people got their blood pressure down a couple millimeters, yes, that would be significant, but it would also be what we call clinically insignificant, like it's not going to make a difference. But this, and actually the NIH knows this. They actually, I can't remember the year, but it was probably about 10 years ago, they decided they'd start looking at the cancer studies again and evaluating what was actually seen to see if they saw this 10% of people being cured, or something similar to that. And I don't think anything ever came of that, at least not that I'm aware of, which of course I'm not aware of everything. There's so much out there. So it could be happening, but I haven't heard a peep about that. And I honestly don't think it's happening.
Yeah. There was something else in your book that I didn't know about and that really shocked me. As I always try to explain, is the FDA model is basically 1 to N, right? Sort of one drug to like thousands of people, what's the effect of it, right? But you could just reverse that. What about N to 1? Like, how about we try to use multiple things on one person to fix something very specific? But you can't really study that,
No,
right? And
no.
and
The
you give the
FDA
example. Yeah, exactly. And you give the example that's something that almost anyone's really familiar with, right? So something is wrong, you're sick, you go to a doctor, you get a medication, you have side effects of the medication, you go to the doctor again, you get another medication against the side effects. But here's the catch, right? So some people take like 8 to 10 medications. The interaction effects between those medications aren't
Yes.
known. Like, we just don't know.
No.
That is so crazy to me.
Well, what's happening now in the industry is the FDA is requiring them to do some studies, but the way those studies are conducted, it's the test drug, and then they give another drug that they know has effects, say, on the metabolism of that drug. But it's only one drug and the new test drug, the new drug. So it's not like the whole kit and caboodle, if you will. And this is, I think, killing a lot of people. There are a lot of, people are taking, 8 to 10 drugs, and they are sometimes more. And what happens if they're having a side effect? The doctor then gives them another one to control that side effect. But, that has its own issues. And your body can detoxify an amazing amount of toxin if it gets one dose. But if you're getting it for decades, you deplete the nutrients that you need to sustain life. For example, statins deplete CoQ10. And so really what should be probably happening is a lot of the statins should have a combination of CoQ10 and the statin. But nobody's doing that. In fact, a lot of the doctors don't even tell their patients about it. I've talked to a number of my friends who are on statins, and I've reminded them about this, and they say, "Oh, my doctor didn't say anything about that." Honestly, at this point in time, this has been known for 20, 30 years. Basically since statins came out, they deplete glutathione, which is a major antioxidant in the body, and CoQ10 will help prevent that. So it's really important because a lot of the side effects of the statins, like the muscle cramps and things like that, are because of this side effect. So we do know in many cases how to prevent it, but medical practice is 20 to 30 years behind the research. I mean, I remember recommending
20 to 30 years.
Yeah, really, honestly. And there's a new book
So we're
out.
living in the 1990s right now when it comes to.
And actually, our current FDA commissioner, Marty McCary, I think is the way he pronounces his name. I just finished his book, Blind Spot, where he actually goes into how long it's taken medical research to become medical practice, and how it's fought by the medical community in many cases, and how data is either misinterpreted or really, lied about, basically. So, and again, the reason I knew that was because I was recommending to my family that they not take hydrogenated oils, back in the 70s, because the research was there, and similar things like that. So, and we've only recently talked about hydrogenated oils, the last 10 years or so?
Yeah.
It's really sad.
Yeah. And that kind of also goes into, so why people kind of defend this process or they think it's good, is arguing, okay, it has this rigor, right? It has these like gold standard randomized control trials. So one example you may know is Daniel Carpenter in this book, Power and Reputation, right? And he doesn't make that many normative claims about the FDA really, but when you ask him, he's saying, all right, it's good because without it, companies wouldn't have the incentive to do these like efficacy studies and randomized control trials, right? But as we kind of just showed, okay, this is kind of not where the science ends, and nobody's arguing that randomized control trials aren't good, right? It's just like having it as a condition for pre-market approval can lead to all sorts of these inefficiencies, right?
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's a
And
very high standard to meet, and it's not always a clinically relevant standard, as I explained with the blood pressure example. So it's and so it's a waste of money, because it's the most expensive part of an FDA approval are the clinical studies for effectiveness. Prior to the 62 amendments, manufacturers only had to show that their drug was safe for the intended use. And if you look at the drug withdrawals before and after 62, what you see is there's no difference between the number, or the percentage, I should say, that were withdrawn. We have not improved safety, and we've paid this horrendous price, and we haven't improved effectiveness either. And the reason that, even though effectiveness testing wasn't required before 62, the way that drugs were tested was the pharma companies would give their drug to a bevy of physicians and ask them to report back on what they saw. And of course, so what the doctors did is they talked about, safety, side effects, efficacy, or effectiveness. And so the companies didn't have much incentive to try to put a drug on the market that wasn't going to be effective, because what would happen is the physicians would just stop prescribing it, and so they would lose money on the whole thing. So they didn't, generally speaking, they didn't put out drugs that weren't effective. So at least they thought they had evidence that they were effective. Let's just put it that way. They had
yeah, I
what they
was
felt were good evidence. And it's as good as the trials.
yeah.
And that's because the trials, they can be manipulated in the way I described. If you're just looking for a statistical difference, then you try to make the people that are in that trial to be fairly uniform.
Yeah, I remember I read that in the book and I was very impressed, and it was kind of something obvious to look at. Like, did we actually get safer drugs compared to before, or more effective drugs? I think you actually said, didn't you say that we got right 10% more effective drugs or something like that?
Okay, so about 10% of the drugs pre 1962 were were considered not effective by the group of people that the FDA asked to examine them, and that was the National Science Foundation, I believe, at the time. So the funny thing is that drugs were taken off the market according to the ratings of this group, but they were all basing it on, pre 1962 data, more or less, and they were not basing it on randomized controlled trials. So drugs were taken off the market without being given the chance to meet the new regulations. And this is partly why the pharmaceutical industry was so upset with the FDA. I mean, basically, this was a war. Naturally, the pharma companies never said a word. And the reason they didn't is because the FDA had the power to punish them. When I presented some of this data at the American Association of Pharmaceutical Sciences years ago, people came up to me and said, "Oh, I'm so glad somebody's speaking out because we're still working in the companies, so we can't say anything, or they might punish our company." Recently, Liberty International, a group that I chair, is putting out a journal. And the first issue is longevity. And some of the people that I've asked to make submissions in the field are saying, "Yeah, we can't really give you something because, the journal is trying to show how regulation is, screwing with the health situation in the US. And, of course, our company would be
Yeah.
harmed." So, yeah,
I wonder, do you think that fear is justified, or are people cowering a bit too much?
oh, yeah, it's way justified. In fact, there was, I think in my book, I talk about the drugs that were put together for, I think the disease is called Ducharme's disease. I might be mispronouncing it. Anyhow,
Yeah,
it's a disease that affects, it's kind of like, it's a muscle wasting disease that happens because of genetic things going on in the body. It's a small group of people, so it's what we would call an orphan drug. And this one company had a lot of success with a particular drug that they were making, but the FDA did not like the CEO, and they did not like this company. And so they kept just demanding more and more studies. And it was kind of ridiculous because the studies that they were demanding would have basically taken the whole US population of these children, you know. And also it would meant biopsying their muscles, which of course are weak. You don't want to biopsy a part of them that's having trouble staying, strong, because you got to stick a needle in them and take a piece of tissue. That's not helpful. So, there might have been an ethical thing going on there too. So what the CEO did is he resigned, hoping that the FDA would then give approval to these things. And it took years and years before the FDA finally decided after that to approve one of the drugs, or at least let it be marketed and tested.
Mm-hmm.
And there's some things where the FDA has just gotten really upset with the developers of a drug. There's a few drugs in Britain that aren't here because of that. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah. And
I'm
the
asking that.
FDA can drag its feet on the approval, by just saying, well, we haven't had a chance to look at the data enough.
Yeah.
And there's nothing the companies can do.
I'm asking that question partly for myself, right? Because we're trying to create a new legal structure under state law and all of that in Montana. We have like this hub in Rotan,
Mm-hmm.
Honduras, right? So, and of course, that is always FDA supremacy clause and all of that. And obviously, I say many critical things of the FDA. My strategy is kind of to come with a bit of nuance and kind of invitation to like, hey, we have a common enemy here, or common problems, which is like American public health, or like manufacturing going to China and things like that, which I feel under the current administration, I'm pretty safe to do that, right? And I'm kind of always wondering, why are not more biotech CEOs or companies kind of choosing a bit of an approach like that? It doesn't have to be like antagonistic, right? It can be like, okay, we really want to figure out kind of what works, and there's obvious problems in your process. Why don't we like just work together? Otherwise, China is doing it better, Japan is doing it better, Australia is doing it better. Like, yeah, am I a bit naive kind of there? Or
Yeah, I mean, let me just say, up to this point in time, the FDA has felt that it needs to call the shots, and it's actually tried to, and now claims your stem cells are drugs. So here's the thing: there were a few innovators in the stem cell area, which is kind of a new frontier and a really great one. This one doctor in Colorado, Centeno, was doing mostly athletes and things. So, because they wanted to get back in the game, they didn't want to, have to have an ACL replacement and have to wait, a year or so to get back in the game. So he was using stem cells, and then he moved on to older people, trying to help them so they didn't need like a knee replacement or something. Well, the problem with older people is they need more stem cells. So he took them and he grew them up in a test tube, basically, and then gave it back to them a week later. Well, the FDA said, well, if you give the stem cells back the same day, like you're doing to athletes, that's medical practice. But if you grow them up in a test tube and then give them to these poor elderly people who are going to have a knee replacement if this doesn't work, no, that's a drug. So now you have to follow all the drug prescriptions, all the jump through all the drug development hoops, which is kind of impossible when you have, a new type of research that you're doing where you have to be able to change what you're doing pretty quickly as you learn more and more. And so that's gone offshore. So unless you're wealthy, and you can afford to go offshore, you can't do that. So it leaves a lot of people behind. And now I will say the current FDA commissioner, I think, has the best chance of maybe changing that, but I don't think he knows what goes on in the FDA. He knows what goes on in medical practice, but the same thing essentially is happening at the FDA, but it's not so visible, let's just say. So I think it's possible that he could be approached on this. And actually, that's what I would suggest if really we want there to be not an adversarial or just a rubber stamp, which is what's happening now. Basically, things are rubber stamped, but if it's outside of the FDA's jurisdiction, they are going to be very upset and come after people. At least this has been the experience of the last, since the 62 amendments, I'll just say. And if for supplements before that.
They don't like things to be outside their jurisdiction.
You got it. And they're expanding their jurisdiction into places where, honestly, and they went to court over this, and the judge unfortunately sided with the FDA. Now that may change because the Supreme Court just got rid of one of the biggest. I'm trying to remember the exact name. You may remember it. Where because there's a
Bader Ginsburg. Yeah.
Well, the one where there's a law. There's a law that says...
the Chevron Deference.
Thank you, Chevron, yes.
Yeah.
The Chevron decision changed that. So what the Chevron, for your listeners, prior to the Chevron decision, the Supreme Court had decided that if a government regulator, a bureaucrat essentially, came up and said, well, we're interpreting the 62 amendments as meaning we can do this, that the courts generally should side with the government bureaucrats. But the Chevron defense, now that happened, I think, 2 years ago, that changed the landscape. It wiped that out. It said, this is stupid. Well, I'm paraphrasing in my own way, but, this is not right. So now I think if somebody sued, when I say somebody, can't be the pharma companies, but if some, individuals have sued the FDA and gotten the judge to say, yes, the FDA needs to allow this. Well, the FDA never did allow it. And what the FDA does, it keeps appealing because it has, the funds to do it. Whereas an individual or even a group of individuals does not. So that's the game that's played. But if ever there was an administration that might support a better partnership or have the FDA back off of people who want to do their own thing, this would be it. Because all the right to try things we've passed, the companies won't engage in it. And there are two major reasons. One, they think the FDA is going to punish them, and it will. Or two, they don't have enough drug to actually just give out to people, because in the early stages of drug development, these drugs are kind of made on the lab bench, not in a manufacturing plant. So there isn't very much of them. So those are the two biggies. And I was told when I worked at the Upjohn company and somebody was asking for compassionate use permission, that the person who had to make that decision in our company said, I'm really nervous about ever doing this, because what happens is if this person dies, and most of these cases are terminal, This person dies after taking our drug. The FDA makes us, like it had happened before, makes us do extra studies to prove it wasn't the drug. And it's kind of hard to prove a negative. So this is a very punishing thing. So this is what's happened in the past, and I think
Yeah.
this is what companies expect will happen in the future. Except now the whole situation's changed since the salaries of these people is basically paid for by the pharma companies. But that's the big pharma companies. It's not the biotech startups. And the big pharma companies want the biotech startups to license to them. And the FDA wants to deal only with big pharma because they know the players and they feel more comfortable doing that. So you've got this entrenched bureaucracy and this entrenched, I don't know what you'd call it, cartelization of between the agency and the pharma companies. But like I said, if there was ever a time after reading Macary's book, I'm convinced he would be the most open that we've ever seen to this. Whether he could get deep enough into the FDA bureaucracy to fix it so that when he leaves, whenever that is, it remains something that, the FDA is going to keep their hands off of. But if there
Yeah,
was
we'll
ever
see.
a time, this is it. This
If
is
there was
it.
ever a time, this is it. Yeah, for sure. I meant to ask if there were actually other times where you were kind of hopeful something could change, and when were those times, and what happened, and what did not happen.
I can't say that there were other times. This
Hmm.
is a unique opportunity, I believe.
Hmm.
I think there have been people in other government agencies that have wanted to do things differently.
Hmm.
What if they've been able to get it to happen? I don't think it stayed in place after they left,
Hmm.
and that's why I said that it would have to be a change deep enough that it stayed in place when Macquarie left.
Yeah.
Frankly, I think we'd be better off without the FDA. I know that's kind of a radical statement, but when you have this much damage, this much life lost because of a bureaucracy, the marketplace would probably not do any worse. They probably
Yeah.
would do a lot better, actually.
Yeah, I mean, the difficult thing is it's very difficult to, just get rid of a very large agency or institution or something like that. The way it usually happens is kind of by replacement, right? So you start like a competitor and you take away some market share. You kind of force that company to change in the process, and
Mm-hmm.
over time, kind of the old stuff withers away, right? So we've seen that in various different industries,
Mm-hmm.
which is what we're trying to do, hopefully, with the states' rights approach. Um, but I'm curious. So the one thing you talk about in the book, and I want to get a bit sort of the edge cases of what we also need to think about, sort of for alternative systems, um, sort of the HIV epidemic.
Oh yeah.
Um, so this was maybe a time when the FDA was kind of challenged in their reputation, at least, um, right? So maybe you can talk a bit about that. And what I'm especially curious about is sort of the sort of more decentralized innovation that happened
Yeah.
in the community that tested out new different drugs on themselves, right?
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yes.
um, yeah.
Yeah. Well, the HIV sufferers, of course, could not wait. Uh, you know, 14 years for a new drug, so they hired chemists and they made them themselves and distributed them throughout the AIDS community. This was a very interesting experiment. They actually did a pretty good job. They kept records of what the side effects were, and because they were using a limited number of doctors, so that was a little easier to do. And there's a lot of valuable information there that was never made use of because it was all in the underground. In fact, one of the activists, when they were testing, I think it was a drug called DDI, they said that they had distributed more of it than was in the clinical trials, which I think is probably correct. I actually was in HIV research for a while. We were working on HIV proteases specifically. And I knew some fluky things were going on because when they approved AZT, it had a lot of side effects. And they did it in a
That's
couple
an
of years.
official drug the FDA approved, I think in
Yeah,
1989 or 90 or something like that, right?
exactly. And I was really puzzled because there were actually other drugs out there that I would have thought would have gotten, if a drug was going to be approved, that there'd be others. Well, then, of course, I find out that the NIH is getting, holds the patent, or at least has part of the patent, and they're getting paid they're getting basically a kickback from the drugs that are sold, AZT that was sold. And I didn't know that Tony Fauci was in charge of that either until I read Kennedy's book, The Real Anthony Fauci. And then I went, aha, that made sense. So what he was doing during COVID was very similar to what he did with HIV. And basically, he wanted to, and he wasn't the only one. A lot of people wanted to keep the idea of using drugs that were already in the market, like ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine. They wanted to basically make sure that those were never acknowledged as something that could help control the COVID virus, because if they did, they couldn't have gotten the EUA on the mRNA vaccine. And they were dedicated to that because, again, I believe the NIH got a considerable kickback on that. And so this is the way the game's played. In other words, it really doesn't matter about the true safety or the true efficacy of something, because the FDA actually stopped. I'm blanking on the name of the drug, but there was a drug that the AIDS community was using to prevent blindness, and the data was strong, but the FDA kept dragging its feet on approving it because it wasn't being done under their auspices. And so a lot of people were not able to use it.
And I'm wondering, especially because I'm pretty sure a bunch of things that the AIDS community tried on themselves didn't work,
Oh,
right?
yeah.
So I think, the process of innovation is, messy. And that's kind of why, people don't like to see that, right? They don't like to see the things that are going wrong, or at least if they're going wrong, they need to be some kind of officiated that they go wrong or something like that. I don't know how to say
the
it.
idea that, somehow these experts are protecting us is what we believe about government. But the truth of the matter is, as I've been trying to point out in this brief podcast, is that it goes the other way a lot simply because of special interests. I think your audience, if they haven't already, might like to watch the movie The Dallas Buyers Club. This was about a Texas group that was distributing drugs and vitamins to HIV patients. And the guy who did it was in charge of that. He actually lived, he was finally convicted, by the FDA in court. And, but he lived like 7 years longer than he was supposed to, because some of these things must have worked, right? And that lesson is important, because they came after him because he did not have this community around him like the California activists did. And I think that's why the FDA not only did not go after the California activists, but allowed them to come to some of the FDA meetings. Nothing much came of it, but they had the illusion that, that they were working with the activists. Of course, the activists weren't stupid. They figured that out pretty quickly. But I mentioned this because I think the FDA did not want a publicity campaign saying, hey, all these people are, really having trouble, and they're having to, cook this stuff in their kitchen because the FDA is not allowing them to take it. And that would have been really bad PR for the FDA. But that is, that story has happened time and time again. And today there are still patients, ALS patients primarily, that are literally cooking the drugs in their kitchen so that they can get treatment. And of course, without the proper equipment and stuff to test and make sure you've got it right, I'm sure there's a lot of problems. But, they're desperate. And the FDA has a history of not allowing what we call compassionate use. What they do, though, is they wait till the last minute when the patient who's been bugging them for months is on their last legs, and then they say yes. And that way they can say, oh, we approve 90% of the compassionate use requests. And that's really fraudulent. I'm sorry, but it is. And you wait to the last minute when there's no hope for the patient. They're on their deathbed, literally. And what happened, because they did that to a girl named Abigail, her father started the Abigail Alliance, and he started evaluating cancer drugs, because the cancer drug she was requesting was specific for her cancer and had a good chance of curing her. He was so angry at the FDA, he started looking into this. And I think the Abigail Alliance, which I understand may not be operating anymore, unfortunately. It was operating when I put my book out, and I think it was 2017. They recommended 40 drugs, cancer drugs, be approved, an average of 2 years before the FDA actually approved them. And I say, hey, if a layperson can look at this stuff and figure out that it's working 2 years before the FDA approves it, what are we waiting for?
And that's also before AI, right?
I'm sorry, before what?
It's before artificial intelligence even.
Oh, yeah, this is way before artificial intelligence.
And now we could do these things, probably even more efficiently for more drugs and sort of reviewing the existing data.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very possibly. I probably should say. I haven't worked with it enough to have an official opinion on it, but yeah. I mean, I do know that it's done pretty well. Actually, some of the earlier studies, I have seen studies done where they used what probably became artificial intelligence, computer programs that probably evolved into that, where they looked for correlations between some data. I don't know where they got the data, but they found that certain drugs had a high probability of helping in certain types of diseases. I've seen that. I've seen that data, and that was way before AI was even given that number.
Yeah. Great. So you mentioned the Abigail Alliance already, and sort of the approach of consumer reports or other kind of organizations being able to assess the effectiveness of drugs on their own or based on available data. Mm-hmm. And another example for that is the market for off-label.
Yes.
And so let's talk a bit about that, and also learned several new things from the book, right? So one thing I didn't know is that the drug companies can't do that, right? So the drug company is not allowed to say, it's been approved for this indication, but they can't now go and say you can use it for this other thing. That's what the clinicians or the doctors have to do on their own.
That's correct,
right?
That's correct. The drug companies can get into big trouble if they say, hey, the doctors are all using it for this indication, even though it wasn't approved by the FDA for that. That's considered off-label, and they cannot advertise it. They get into big trouble if they do. They can't even hand doctors research papers that talk about the off-label use without getting into trouble, or at least that used to be.
So crazy, right?
I know.
Well, you are the company that has the most information on this drug, and obviously there are drugs that work for more than one thing.
That's right.
But you're not allowed to tell that to the people who are going and saving people's lives with that stuff.
Right? Yeah, well, I think now that's changed a little bit. I think now there are certain papers, I don't know how they're selected, that you can give the doctors on off-label indications. But when I was in the business, no, that was not the case. So, and I left in the mid-90s, so that gives you an idea. Yeah.
Yeah. And this is a really subtle but such an important point, right? So again, sort of the FDA has the model of 1 to n, right? And the model is one drug, one disease, right? So like the intended use and all of that,
Mm-hmm.
right? So, but again, one thing might actually work for multiple things, but it's approved for marketing only for this one thing, right? And then off-label basically means, okay, you have clinicians, doctors that are using it on patients, and they see, hey, actually it works on something else. And that kind of through decentralized word of mouth or adoption, it becomes kind of common knowledge, and multiple doctors use that drug
Mm-hmm.
that is produced for something else, for another indication or disease, on a regular basis to treat patients, right? And so that means there is a market out there
Oh, yeah.
um, for drugs that are not proven effective for what they're used for.
Yeah. Well, see, that's the thing. What happens with most off-label drugs is that some of the doctors figure out, either because they have a background in enough background to suspect that a drug will work, or maybe they consulted AI. Who knows? Anyhow, they decide that they're going to try it in this patient because nothing else is working, and voila, it works. And so they might have a letter to a journal and say, hey, do a case study on this patient. This is something to consider. Or in some cases, it may become standard practice in their group of doctors, and then they publish something. So a lot of times there is pretty good evidence for the drug working, and and but here's what happens: the drug company, if they wanted to advertise it, they would have to jump through a bunch of hoops again, and it's really kind of not worth it, because the current medical system pretty much is, it's probably not moving as fast on off-label drugs as it could, but it's the trade-off isn't worth it at this point. So it's rare that a company will go and get an off-label use. There are exceptions, but generally they don't go that route. And actually, another supplement in the other direction is, normally now drug companies don't work with supplements, but again, there are exceptions. A fish oil, for example, has been so beneficial that a couple different companies took one of the active ingredients in fish oil. There are several. Took one of the active ingredients, the biggest one, and they put like a special chemical group on it. So it's a new compound, right? It can get patented, and then they can go and get FDA approval for it, and they did. And so they go to the doctors and they say, oh, this prescription fish oil is approved by the FDA. And of course, what happens when you take it is that special group falls off. And it's essentially, you're having one of the components of fish oil, not all of them. So it's not as good as fish oil. And my sister was a candidate for this, so she checked the prices. Her copay was as much as if she went and got the best fish oil on the market. So this is how inexpensive supplements become expensive drugs. Because, of course, since she's only having to do a copay, her insurance is probably paying 5 times that much. And it's not necessary. And it's only one component. It's not even a complete fish oil. So, yeah. But the FDA doesn't like natural products, because every batch is a little bit different, because it's a natural product. And they don't like that. So they rarely approve them.
Yeah. So mingling all these things together that we talked about that are problems with the process, in the book you make a calculation that blew me off my chair in terms of how many how many lives are saved due to the drug amendments or the way regulation works or the process versus how many lives are lost.
Yes,
And
well,
the answer, yeah. Mm-mm.
especially the earlier drugs, the ones that were post 62 and prior to 92. They're probably the best collection of effective drugs, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
It's not that we don't have effective drugs after that, but I think the drugs that
Yeah.
came out in that period were
Yeah.
actually helpful for the most part.
Yeah. I mean, the calculation where you're basically looking at, okay, we type 1, type 2 error, we're preventing some bad drugs from going to the market that might like kill someone. And then like type 2 error, okay, we're preventing good drugs from going to the market that save
Mhm.
people. Whereas sometimes ask people, okay, what do you think is the balance? Like how many lives do we save for one life lost? Right? And then
Yes.
in the book, you're like, no one actually, like for one life saved, we're killing 338 people in the most conservative possible scenario, right? So, which
Yeah.
is absolutely shocking. And
Yes, it is
the all the
shocking.
arguments you make and the premises and the numbers are very compelling.
Yeah.
So that was a big takeaway of mine from the book.
Hmm.
So we're going towards the end of this conversation. I have at least how are you doing with time? Do you have a hard stop?
No, no, I do not.
Okay. There's definitely one question I really want to ask you because you're libertarian, and so I'm sure or I suspect you've also thought about sort of the legislative evolution of the FDA or the administrative state over time, starting sort of
Hmm.
from the intention of the founders of the Constitution. What is kind of your read or your story on that? How we got basically to the modern FDA having the power it has, even though that's not something that the founders actually wanted. In fact, you can read many quotes that
No.
that's exactly what we want to prevent. So,
Hmm. Well, actually, Benjamin Rush was one of our founders, and he said if we don't put health freedom in the Constitution, this is what's going to happen. So he
yeah.
predicted it. He said there'd be a privileged class of people who would determine, what we could and couldn't do in the health sector. He didn't say it in quite those words, but I'm paraphrasing what he said, and he was prophetic because. And we've seen during COVID, of course, the government felt they could take our jobs away if we didn't get the COVID vaccine. I mean, that's an incredible thing because if the government can tell us what we must put in our bodies, we're really kind of their property, you know, and we're at their mercy. And this is not how the Constitution. I mean, the founders did not. That was not their plan. So we probably should have had that, and maybe we need to put it in the Constitution. A health freedom amendment. I've seen several of them that have been promoted by different people, and maybe maybe that would be helpful in Montana, putting something like that in their state constitution, because then,
Mm,
I mean, because the Constitution does say that anything that is not deliberately given in this Constitution to the federal government, any power that's not deliberately given isn't there. I think, maybe a health freedom constitutional amendment in the states that are trying to do things differently might be helpful, and actually might go to the Supreme Court and might win. It's
yeah.
something to think about, but
Yeah.
I'm not sure I answered your question appropriately. Did I cover what you wanted me to cover?
I mean, up to you. Maybe what I found so interesting is, the U.S. founders probably were the most libertarian statesmen in history ever. And the constitution was intended to set up limited government, and you already quoted the
Yes.
enumerated powers. So government can only do what's explicitly enumerated, what's in here.
Mhm.
Otherwise, they can't do it. Like any English speaker can read that for themselves. So
Yeah.
why do we have all these agencies? They're not
Oh,
in
okay.
there,
Yes, I
right?
didn't address it. Yes, there's a
Yeah,
commercial,
yeah,
yes, a commerce clause in the Constitution,
exactly.
basically saying that the government could do what's necessary for commerce. And I think there's another. I'm not. I'm not recalling exactly the other
Mhm.
part of that, but they have interpreted that. They call it the Commerce Clause. They have interpreted that to mean that they have jurisdiction over anything that involves state to state commerce. And what this usually meant for the FDA, by the way, is in Texas here, one of the doctors tried to treat cancer patients in the state with his stuff that he had, he had figured out there was something in the urine that might be protective for the cancer patients. And so he was treating them. And his argument was that he was staying in the state of Texas. Well, the FDA's argument was no, you're buying chemicals from other states to make your product. And, this is kind of one of the ramifications of the Commerce Clause. So it's okay for us to do that. I don't know how well that got actually accepted, though, because subsequent to that court case, if I recall correctly, this doctor was sued multiple times, but this time by his medical board. And I think what happened is he was, I think somehow the FDA collaborated on that, but I can't be sure of that. I don't have the evidence. I mean, he always said that had happened, but I haven't seen data to suggest that. So I'm just letting everyone know that it could be not quite as I'm rendering it. But I think that the FDA probably did encourage that. And what's happened, what's evolved since that time is this idea that actually Marty McCarry talks about in his book, that the whole medical profession is trying to develop what they call standard of care. And it's very, it's basically, he was even asked at one time, I think maybe this illustrates it more. When he was going to give a talk, he got a questionnaire from the university, or maybe it was I think it might have been an association. Anyhow, he had to check a box saying, I'm not going to talk about anything that would go against the medical consensus, which is just the exact opposite of how we want our doctors to operate. We want them to think. We want them to apply their knowledge to us as individual patients, not as groupthink. I'll give you an example. It's not in my book. So I took, we have a lot of cancer in my family. I've had it twice. And I took a test. I've been taking, early warning tests, right? So I took an early warning test, and I could see that I had a problem, but that it probably wasn't going to show up on any imaging yet. So I brought this to my oncologist, and I said, hey, I know this isn't going to show up on imaging yet, but you're my doctor. I wanted you to have that. And she says, oh, we don't bother with that. That's not standard of care. Needless to say, I have a new oncologist.
Yeah. But yeah, to the Commerce Clause part, I mean, the history is afterwards that there were like several court cases, and especially like Wickard versus Filburn, that basically interpreted that clause extremely broadly, to the point basically where the federal government can basically do anything they want under the Commerce Clause.
Yeah.
So that's kind of how we got the modern regulatory system and the administrative state that we have today, which is shocking. The founders went above and beyond to really create this very thought through system of checks and balances and all of that. And at least in the reading of Charles Murray, whom I have a lot of respect for, like, this is over. Like, what was conceived as the United States, how the founders envisioned it, does not exist anymore.
Well, I was kind of uplifted by the fact that a lot of people woke up during COVID.
Yeah,
when government,
including myself. That's for me when I started to I guess become radicalized, you can say, right?
Well, okay, yes, and it's good. It's good because people were kind of, I mean, okay, I get it. It's really nice to think that the government's taking care of us. Somebody's taking care of us, right? That's nice to think about. And it's really scary to think the people who have the most power in this country are not only not taking care of us, they're doing things that hurt us. that's scary. A lot of people, I think, they resist making that transition in their thinking because it's scary. And I get it. I get it. It is. I think I was fortunate that this happened when I was young. So I was more accepting. And maybe as an older person, I wouldn't have been. I don't know. I don't know what it, people are different, you know. It is scary to think that your government is out to get you. And in some cases, that's been the case. I mean, we have historical examples, you know, even in our own country, where the government was out to get some group of people. And it's scary. So, but if we don't recognize what truth is, if we don't recognize what's actually happening, then we have no way to fix it. So as scary as it is, you have to face up to that, I think. And that is truly the situation, because it's not about, I mean, for some people in government, yes, it's about helping people. But even if they have that desire and it's very deep, the way the system is set up, it's set up to minimize change, right? And maximize the bureaucracy. And so that's what's wrong with the system. And that's because the Constitution wasn't, excuse me, a totally libertarian document. It allowed government to some extent. And when, what I mean by that is we allowed government to do things to us that we are not allowed to do to each other. Things that we do that the government does to us would be considered a crime if we did it to each other. And this is a big dichotomy, and most people don't see it. They don't see that, you know, we actually honor the non-aggression principle when we deal one-to-one. But when we deal group to group, especially when government's involved, all bets are off, you know. So until we recognize that we've let government do something that we consider immoral, if we do to each other, I mean, it's just as immoral if government does it. And this is not a theological thing. This is an ethical thing. This is a life and death thing, quite literally life and death. And we saw this during COVID. And I think that's why a lot of people woke up.
The problem of political authority, right?
Mm-hmm.
But this is, I think, going to be a problem that's going to stay around for a very long time. But we've also made, I think, tremendous progress. Like when you look at the history of humanity broadly, you know, the flame of liberty was like very weak in most times and is very fragile at any time. But once in a while it flames up, and I think it's, when it does, then it makes a very large impact for a very long time, and will only, you know, continue when we do something for it. And, you know, I'm very optimistic at these times that there's things we can do, especially right now. But there's always hope and always things we can do.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and you know, I being chair of Liberty International, I have to say that I really don't make predictions very much, but I did kind of always think that if the U.S. went down, which I hope it doesn't, that developing countries just have to look at the internet and find out what the secret of prosperity is. It's freedom. And I always felt that what would happen is some developing country would say, we're sick of being poor. We're going to get libertarian. And lo and behold,
and a couple of them do, right?
Argentina just elected
a bit of El Salvador
a year ago.
And Uruguay to some degree as well for some time, right? Or Paraguay to some elements, and you know, Dubai, Singapore. Like this is, you know, of course it's not like the whole package that we'd like in any of these countries really, but you know, any element of freedom that you add is probably good for you. So
yes, and I'm delighted to see, and I'm delighted to hear you telling me about these other countries. I was, of course, aware of Argentina because we were there. We, Liberty International, was there in August, and we gave an award to Javier.
I was about to travel there as well, but wasn't able to in the end. And also Honduras, right? So I think really when the zones here succeed, and the crucial election is actually this November. then this could really be sort of the next frontier for governance. Like, it has a fascinating history. It really came from inside, from libertarian Honduran attorneys that wanted to really bring that into the country. So
Good, good.
learning here how difficult it is and how fragile. But again, if it works, then it will work big.
Yeah. Well, nobody ever thought that the colonies, the American colonies, would beat the British Army. So you never
Yeah, yeah,
know.
yeah,
You never know. And who would have predicted that? Hardly
yeah,
anyone
yeah.
actually predicted that. So there can be discontinuities, and we can't always know when those are coming. So my belief is, if we don't blow ourselves off the earth, we will eventually become libertarian, because that gives us mostly what we want. Freedom is really the key to prosperity and peace, and really our pursuit of happiness. Without that, doesn't guarantee happiness, but at least allows us to pursue it. So I'm
Amen.
optimistic in the long run. Like I said, if this species survives and we don't blow ourselves up, we will eventually become libertarian, and we will enjoy the fruits of that, hopefully for many centuries.
Amazing. Amen. Mary, this was a really insightful conversation that I really enjoyed, as much as reading your book and meeting you and getting your insights and advice on some of the things that I'm doing, which I hope will continue. Mary, is there anything else that you'd like to point listeners to when it comes to your work, how they can get in contact
Sure.
with you or learn more about your work?
Well, my books are on Amazon. They're also at my website, ruwart.com, Ruwart, just like my last name.com. And I do have Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and I guess it's now X, I guess. And basically just put my name in there. It's a fairly unique name, so you'll find me.
Mary, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Oh, well, you're welcome. I'm glad you had me. I enjoyed talking to you, and I enjoyed sharing information with your listeners, because that's why I wrote the book, to get that knowledge out there. The more we know, the more we can do.